Hi everyone, welcome to another video in Logic. In this video we're going to be looking at mixing vocals for a kind of rock, hard rock, electronic rock sound, and we're going to be using Logic Pro 10. So I did a video a couple years ago now which covered similar sort of stuff. It was vocal mixing and editing, but I wanted to do some stuff on vocals again simply because in the last couple of years, my workflow's changed a little bit, discovered some interesting little things I want to share with you, and hopefully that'll help some of you out, or it might just be quite interesting to see the way I do some of my vocals. I hope that's interesting to you. So the song I'm going to be using is my song Control from the Psychosis EP, and let's get started. So the way I want to structure this video is to do 3 main stages of processing to the vocals. The first stage is going to be the fundamental processing after we bring the recordings into the mix for the first time, and this is going to involve EQing, compression, and a little bit of de-essing. After we've done that for each part, I want to move on to some more decorative effects, as in echo and some delay, some reverb, and those sorts of effects. And finally, we're going to look at some other interesting effects you can have once you've got those 2 core pieces in place that you can kind of slot in some interesting effects if you want to put a particular stamp on your vocal, make it sound kind of unique with a certain effect. I'll show you an easy way to drop some stuff like that in there as well. So first of all, I'm just going to play you the final chorus, essentially the final product where we hope to end up, and then I'm going to tear it all away and go back to square one and essentially rebuild it. So here's the final chorus as we're hoping to achieve at the end of this video. So that's, I suppose, a fairly standard hard rock chorus. You've got some quite busy stuff going on instrumentally, and then the vocals got to slot in there and kind of fit in the mix as well. Not a tremendous amount effects-wise going on with the vocals, but enough to just make it, like I say, fit in there. So we'll see how we can replicate that sound. First thing I'm going to do is just take these tracks away, and I've got my recordings here as if I've just brought them into the project, nothing done to them. Aside from assembling the takes that I liked, and I've also put a little bit of initial compression on there as well, but really not a lot, just to even things out a little bit. They're otherwise untouched. So I've got my lead vocal here, so let's just drag that to where it should be. This is probably going to be quite loud, so I'll bring that level down a bit and take a listen. Gonna end with me lose. So completely untouched, as you can hear. The first thing I want to do is, and this isn't entirely necessary depending on the situation, is to compress that vocal a bit more. This is more crucial or more important in tracks that are quite busy already, and you want the vocal never to duck into the background. You want a consistent level. And so compression can really help you out in achieving that. But before I add any further compression to the vocal, what I'm going to do is put an EQ on there. And that basically is going to let us play around a little bit with the frequencies and get rid of some frequencies we just don't want. Why would you put them through a compressor if you're not going to want them at the end of the day? And do a bit of boosting as well. So the first thing, I tend to find it's good practice just to take some of those low frequencies out of there. And again, this will depend on exactly how you have done your recordings, but you may have encountered the proximity effect where you're very close to your mic, bass frequencies are kind of exaggerated, and they're very obvious. So I tend to find with a vocal that has a lot of bass frequencies in there, it just doesn't sound like it fits in the mix. So it's good practice just to take those out. Got a low shelf here, and we can just kind of take those away and ignore those real extreme lows. It's normally fine, but it's a good practice thing to do anyway. The other thing I want to do is to actually add a little boost up at about 12k or so, maybe just shy of 12k. I'll narrow the peak there. Basically, I'm doing this to give a little bit of clarity, or a little bit more clarity, and a nice kind of airiness to the vocal. If I take this up to an extreme and play it back, you'll see what I mean. It's quite subtle, but it just adds a little bit of a boost up there, and like I say, it gives it a nice clarity, and helps it cut through the background again a little bit more as well. That's the only two things I'm going to do in terms of EQ so far. We can come back to it. That's fine. Nothing is set in stone at this stage. And the second thing I'm going to do is add that compressor. This is a preset that I've taken through, many albums of music and vocals, and not changed it all that much, simply because it works for me really well. You might have your own presets that you use in a similar way, but for me, this is kind of the vocal compression that I use quite a lot. Since the level of that vocal, the actual recording's already quite high, it's already had a little bit of compression, I'm just going to knock that threshold up a little bit. I only really want the very loud parts of that vocal to hit that threshold and be reduced. If you go overboard on it, it can be quite an obvious sound, and you want to avoid that. So with the gain on there, that's probably boosted it up quite a bit. So let's knock that down and see how that sounds. So you can see the reduction and the compression being engaged on those loud parts quite harshly. So that's alright, that's fine. It's not too much. We can change it later. And the final thing that I want to do for now with that lead vocal is to de-ess it. And this is something which I actually didn't do for a long time, and I've only recently started doing this. But I always used to notice that in my final tracks, after I put them through mastering and compression on the whole track, is that the S sounds of the vocal were really, really exaggerated. And I didn't really, I suppose I could have gone and EQ'd it, but since I discovered the de-esser in Logic, it's been a really helpful tool. So we're going to add the de-esser on there, and again, we're going to leave these pretty much defaults. You might question, having EQ'd the track and had a boost up in those highs, why would I want to then de-ess? And there is a bit of overlap in the frequencies, because our center frequency for that peak is about 12K. Center here is 10K, so they're not exactly the same. So it's still worth doing. There's going to be a little bit of overlap, but I just don't worry about it too much, to be honest. That strength is quite harsh. I'll leave it there so you can hopefully see the difference in those S sounds being really taken down. So you could hear it really obviously there. I tend to hover the strength about between 4 and 6, depending on lead or double vocal or backing vocal or whatever. Again, it's quite a subtle effect, but you can just play with it and see what works for you. So that's kind of the end of our fundamental processing for the lead. We'll come back to the lead, but we're going to look at the double for now. And since actually quite a lot of the settings are going to be the same as for this lead, what I'm just going to do is duplicate the track that we had there. I'll rename this to lead double. So here's our double here. I'm going to drag that in. This is essentially another take of the same chorus that I sang. Maybe I didn't like it as much as the first one to use as the lead, but it's perfectly fine as a double. So if I just drop that in and play the two together, they do kind of clash, as you will hear now. Gonna end with me losing control. So if that's the kind of effect you're going for, then great, but personally I kind of don't go for that kind of extreme clashing between the lead and the double. So the first thing we're going to do is just bring that down. Oh, this is not gonna end with me losing. So it's just in the background there a little bit more. Next thing I'm going to do, see with this EQ here, I'm going to take that high down a little bit. I just don't want to necessarily clutter up those high frequencies too much if we're doing, and this can be especially obvious if you're doing this on quite a few tracks and you're doing the same boost of EQ in the same place. You will start to really ramp up those frequencies across the whole track, or across the whole mix, I should say, and that'll get really obvious really quick. So you know what? I'm actually just going to turn off this peak for now. We can come back to it if we find that we need a little bit of a boost there, but I'm just going to turn that off to avoid kind of cluttering things up and them competing with each other too much. Since that vocal is going to be a little bit more in the background, maybe I want to be a bit harsher on the compression, so I'm going to lower that threshold down just a little bit and see how that sounds. Actually going to be a bit harsher on that de-esser on the lead, just a little bit. I think that sounds all right as a first kind of go of things. The last thing I want to do to that double, and this is to really avoid it competing with the lead even more, but also have a really strong sense of stereo and fullness to the entire vocal part. You can add a sample delay to this double. So essentially what we're doing there is we're delaying the right channel. I delay it about 1,000 samples or so. And the effect of this, as you'll hear, you get a really kind of wide stereo effect. Oh, this is not gonna end with me losing control. So that's quite cool to have. And once you've got it playing with that lead as well, you'll find that the whole thing sounds very big and sounds very rich. Oh, this is not gonna end with me losing control. Just doing a bit more level balancing there. You'll find yourself playing with these levels, so much as you go along. Just kind of go with it and see what sounds good at every stage. So that's the final fundamental processing I want to do on the double. And finally, our backing vocal. Again, actually, this is going to be a lot of the same stuff that we did for that double there. Let's drag our backing vocal in, rename the track. Now, you could leave the sample delay in, you could take it out. I'm going to take it out because I wanted to reinforce that initial lead part a little bit more. I want quite an obvious harmony, as if it's two voices as opposed to, a lead and tons of other voices, let's say. But that's really up to you. You could widen out that stereo field with the backing or just leave it. Now, strangely enough, with the EQ, I'm actually going to make a dip there. Mostly because if we are more prominently playing with the lead, which is getting a boost there, I don't want them competing. I don't want them clashing too much in that frequency band. So we're just going to cut it down there. The compressor threshold's probably fine because we changed it for the double to be a bit harsher. DS, you probably don't need it. It's going to be so quiet that you're not really going to notice. But apart from that, I think we should be pretty much good. So let's take a listen to that. This is not gonna end with me losing control. Actually, that level's okay. Thought I was gonna have to change that, but it sounds all right there at the moment. So let's leave it there for now. So, after what seems like a long time, that's the end of our kind of fundamental initial processing of the vocals that we've brought them in, and we could trim that down as well because I've just seen we don't need that. So the next thing we're going to do is add some more interesting kind of decorative effects like echo and reverb. And what I'm actually going to want to do for the main part, i.e. the lead and the double, is just apply the same effects to both of them. So the way I can make this slightly easier is if I send both tracks to a bus. So let's send them to bus 23, for example, and that just gives me a single place where these tracks are being routed so that then I can add effects here and they'll be applied to both. It just saves me time as opposed to adding the effects independently in each track there. So I quite like delay sounds and echo sounds. Let's try a stereo delay for good reason in this case. So a regular echo is kind of quite nice sometimes, but again, more recently I've liked experimenting with really widening out the stereo field and the how wide the vocals can feel in the mix. And we can do a similar thing that we did with that sample delay on that double with the actual echo. So I'm going to set both of these to the same delay, both quarter note. I'm going to bring down the mix just a little bit. Even though the mix is quite low here, it is quite an obvious echo, and especially the higher you go, you'd be surprised. But the way I can play with that stereo, you see groove here, that's essentially, it's a delay on each channel. It's a little bit of an offset from being on the beat. So what I'm going to do is just very slightly bring that down. That's the left channel to 49% and the right up to 51, so about 2% difference. And you can see now, in milliseconds, there is a delay between the left channel echo and the right channel echo, or delay, I should say, of almost 20 milliseconds. So the effect that that's going to have when I play this back, you should hear the actual echo. I don't know how obvious it'll be. I'll bring up the level in a second. But you should hear quite a wide stereo effect on that echo.
This is not gonna end with me losing control. You've won this fight.
Especially obvious on some of those S sounds. And actually that brings me on to my next point, which is when I hear an echo or a delay effect, I really don't like hearing those S sounds going through the echo. So handily enough, we've got a little bit of an EQ kind of business we can do here. So I'm going to bring a high cut down to about 7.5K, or, let's be a bit harsher actually, let's go to 7K. And that's just going to roll off those highs and prevent them from going through that, through the output mix of the delay, and you're not going to get those horrible S sounds going through the delay.
Oh, this is not gonna end with me losing control. Won this fight.
Sounding pretty good so far. So the very last thing I want to do to these lead parts, and this is, again, quite subtle. You can play with this to your heart's content and really make it your own. I think to make it fit quite nicely into the mix as a kind of really final step is to add a little bit of reverb. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to pick a reverb, platinum verb. And like I say, this is going to be quite subtle, so we're going to bring the wet down. I tend to use anywhere between kind of 12 and 22%, let's say. So let's go somewhere in the middle there. And bring the reverb time down a little bit. But other than that, we're just going to leave all these things default. Like I say, you can play with these to your heart's content. But I do what I think sounds good, and hey, the default sounds pretty good, so let's stick with it. So that might be quite subtle. I'll bring the mix up so you can hear it, but...
Oh, this is not gonna end with me losing control.
just kind of pushes it back a little bit in the mix, and makes it sound like the vocal is actually being sung in an environment as opposed to sort of right next to your ear, which can be a bit distracting, let's say. For the backing, you can add something similar, just put that straight on its own track. You might want something a bit more obvious since it's already quite far in the background. And hey, since we're on the topic of defaults, let's just leave everything as it was, because why not? And let's see how things sound. And I think that's pretty close to what we had at the start of the video. So, great. We've achieved our objective in that sense. And now we can look at some slightly more interesting stuff. So now that you've got those fundamental processing steps in place and you've got your more decorative stuff, you can actually drop some stuff in between to create some quite interesting effects. And especially if you want to kind of create your own recognizable vocal sound, this is a good way to do it, or it's a good place to do it. Obviously, there's many, many things you can do, but I'm just going to show you a couple here. So, for example, we could put some quite harsh pitch correction on that lead vocal. So let's put that effect there. Let's put the response right down so it's a very obvious effect, and let's just see how it sounds.
This is not gonna end with me losing control.
So that's interesting. I'm sure you could play with that to make it really a bit more prominent in the mix. You know, if you put it at the start of the bus instead, maybe that could be interesting. You can do stuff like that. Other things you can do, you know, you could put quite a hard flange effect on there.
This is not gonna end with me losing control.
But really, it's just a matter of playing around with stuff and finding things that sound cool. Another one that I like to do sometimes is this clip distortion. So let's really drive that up. Let's put the gain up. We will need to adjust these once we hear it, but let's just see how that sounds.
This is not gonna end with me losing control. You've won this fight now.
And you can achieve some quite interesting effects. I tend to use that clip distortion. Well, in this song, I actually use it in the verses. But, you know, you can drop it in, make things a little bit more interesting, and, you know, it's quite cool. It's quite fun. So I think we're going to stop there because this is probably quite a long video. I don't know how long we've been going, but I hope you've picked up something from this, regardless of your level. I hope it's been interesting to see my workflow, and I hope you can take something away from that. If there's anything else you want to see, kind of the way I do things in Logic, please let me know in a comment. And with any luck, I'll be back with a few more of these. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.